And so today we do continue with this wonderful work of welcoming the unwelcome, this book by Pema Chodron, A Wholehearted Living in a Broken-Hearted World. Earlier in this month, we took a look at this different approach, kind of an opposite way of addressing discomfort and pain when it comes up in our lives. Rather than avoid the pain or the conflict, we identify it and we take a 3-step process to soothe and heal ourselves, as well as soothe and heal our world. This practice connects us with our world rather than separates us. And it truly supports the second commandment to love our neighbors as ourselves. For when we identify what's uncomfortable, painful within us, we take it into our heart to soothe and heal ourselves. And we then recognize that whatever we're feeling is no different than that feeling that everyone in the world experiences, and we pull their pain, their discomfort into our heart. Love them. Love our neighbor as ourself. Well, this past week I had a wonderful opportunity to practice and benefit from this very powerful practice. Denny and I are renovating the home that we live in, and we're doing all of the work ourselves. We're laying down hardwood floor and tile, we're painting, we tore apart the fireplace and completely redesigned the fireplace. It's a big job. We started the middle of October, and here it is the end of January, and we're still at it. And of course now I'm serving Unity of the Keys, and I don't have as much time to dedicate, to commit to this project. And of course Denny is the more skilled worker in this scenario anyway, and the more tireless worker, but I'm a pretty good helper, and I've learned the names of a lot of tools. But one day this week, when we were laying down some flooring and putting down some trim, I recognized that I was in a really bad mood. I mean, a really, really bad mood. I was grumpy, I was irritated. I'd pick up a piece of wood I'd consider using, and it was 2 inches too short. Rawr! I mean, I was not in a good space. I thought maybe I was just weary of working because it was either doing church work or doing house work on the house, as well as housework. And although I enjoy all of that, I wondered if I was just weary. So Denny and I talked about it, and I took the rest of the day off. And I committed to this process of identifying what was going on in me so that I could heal and soothe whatever it was. That's the first step, is to identify, to take a brave and direct look at what's going on with us. A brave and direct look, rather than avoid the discomfort. And that's really where I got stumped, because a bad mood is not a feeling. Being grumpy is not the feeling, it's the side effect, it's the outcome, it's the outpicturing of whatever is going on within us. And so I started digging. Well, what's going on with me? Was I irritated? Oh, yeah. Was I annoyed? Yes. I just kept digging. Because I knew the house projects, really, that was not what was irritating me. And I knew it wasn't Denny, because he had just made me this wonderful breakfast, my favorite, traditional oatmeal with craisins and walnuts. So it wasn't Denny. But I just kept digging. Where did this start? I didn't wake up feeling this way. So what had happened that led me to this space? And I just kept going back to the morning, backing up. And when I hit on it, my eyes filled with tears, and I knew immediately what it was. For I had a plan. And in my world, my plan was that I was to get both of my COVID vaccines by the end of February, maybe the beginning of March, in plenty of time that I could plan to be present there with all of you at Unity of the Keys for Palm Sunday and for Easter Sunday and for sunrise service out at the beach. And I had just read a notice that morning from the state of Arkansas that my group was going to have their vaccine rolled out in April. And Denny and I talked briefly about it, but I really didn't have time to let it soak in, to absorb it completely. But that was it. Was it disappointment? Yes, it was disappointment, but it was more than that. It was grief. It was a deep grief. For I truly want to be with you all. I want to be connected in a more personal way with those of you that are comfortable, being face to face with the precautions that we use. But once I named it, once I was able to identify it, I could follow that 3-step process. I could take that grief into my heart. I could let it bathe there in that space of compassion and love and acceptance and allow it to be soothed. I could then recognize that the grief I was feeling was no different than everyone else on this planet experiences, and invite their grief into my heart for that same bathing in the love and compassion and acceptance to be soothed right there. 3 very simple steps, truly powerful, for my morning was transformed. My day was shifted. I was back centered and grounded. And yes, it's possible that the plan in Arkansas will change. What this did was free me up then to work on another plan, a plan B, so that the sunrise service could still happen at the beach, because I obviously can't Zoom there. But it gave me the ability and the strength to move beyond what I was feeling emotionally, to allow that to be healed, at least to a certain extent, and to move forward. Today, I present from this same book 4 more practices that are presented by Pema Chodron. These are approaches, these are perspectives, these are relatable advice on how to live in these turbulent times, and how to live in this world that we have created. And I invite you to listen to these 4 and maybe choose 1 or choose 2 that you'd like to practice throughout this week. The first one that I'm presenting is called, Does It Matter? Does it matter? And I'll start with a quote from the book. When we start to ask ourselves, does it matter? We realize how many aspects there are to every situation. We begin to appreciate how interconnected we are to the rest of the world, and how even our thoughts, our thought patterns can lead to a whole series of consequences. And what she's presenting in this work is that there are times in our lives, there are times throughout the day where we are faced with choices, own personal choices, some of them large, some of them very, very minor. But when we decide if we're going to send an email that might be a little bit terse, or if we glare at someone, if we say something unkind or think something unkind, are there consequences? Does it matter? Even if they don't know about it, what if we take that last piece of cake or drink that drink and throw the can out the window? Does it matter? Do our thoughts, which then back up our actions, do they matter? What if we do say something unkind and we feel justified by it, does it matter? Or if we end up apologizing, does that matter? And what she says is that we can ask ourselves, does it matter? We can first look at the outer, more obvious results of our actions, how it might affect someone else. But we can ask ourselves, are we making a habit more habitual? Are we following thought patterns that are so deeply rooted in us that they've become routine and we're not even aware that it is a choice? And so are we strengthening propensities that we'd rather see weakened in us? Are there some aspects of ourselves that we would prefer that they be diminished, not enhanced? She says the better question might be, what awakens my heart? And what blocks that process from happening? And so as we're making that choice, when we're deciding in our minds what we think, how we hold that person, they might not know we're glaring at them, but we're glaring internally. How does that help me? Does that awaken my heart? Or does that block it from happening? And so that's the question that we're to ask ourselves. And she goes on to talk about how in science we are aware now of this neuroplasticity, and that we all have patterns, ways of being that are deeply grooved into our brain, so to speak. These patterns are deeply grooved. And that's why it's so difficult for us to change. That's why it's so difficult for us to break those patterns. But through awareness, we can. Through awareness, we can escape those patterns, and we can create new grooves. We can create new ways of being. For the aim is to wake up to the benefit of all others, to love our neighbors as ourselves. And we can only love our neighbors if we are having kind thoughts, kind actions, kind words. And so we have this aspect of, does it matter? It does indeed matter. What we think matters. Everything counts, for everything leaves an imprint on us, an imprint on our minds, and we can choose to change. The second tool she suggests has to do with polarization. And this is so apparent in our world, and it's apparent in the ways that that we live. You know, we look at opposite poles. We look at good and bad, cold and hot, up and down. Well, when we're looking at our world, especially when we're looking at problems in our world, it's so easy to have a tendency to divide people and things and ideas into very specific categories, which then in our minds becomes us and them. That is polarization. And when we have polarization, it's hard to find middle ground. Middle ground where we can agree, middle ground where we can be at peace, middle ground where we can be accepting, where everything is at one pole or the other. And when whole nations hold this aspect of polarization, this is magnified. It can lead to discrimination, oppression, even war. And so she suggests that we allow ourselves to become aware of when we are doing that. Throughout the day, we can ask ourselves, am I perpetuating a sense of separateness from me and the rest of the world? Or am I perpetuating a sense of oneness, of connection? And she gives this wonderful example. So you're getting ready to get in the shower, and you notice that there's a spider. And you're not a fan of spiders. And you have a couple of choices. And the first one, and probably the one that's going to come up first for many of us, is to turn on the water and let the spider, just take a chance. What's going to happen? That's polarization. That's, I'm separate from that living being. And yet, we both want to live. Neither one of us want to die. And so another choice is to take a paper. I usually take a sheet of paper and a cup, because as soon as I get that spider on the paper, I know it's going to jump off. So you take the cup and you put it over the paper so that you can take the spider outside. Doesn't seem like a big deal. It's a big deal to that spider. First thing in the morning, you've had your shower, and already you've saved a life. And that simple action connects you to the rest of the world, connects you to all living beings, recognizing that we all do want to live. She also gives a wonderful little example here of, it's called Just Like Me. Go to some place where you're going to see lots of people, maybe the parking lot of a grocery store. And as you see each person, you say to yourself, just like me, that person wants to be happy. Just like me, that person wants to have a place where they feel safe. Just like me, that person wants to have harmony in their relationships. Just like me. And in doing so, again, you are emphasizing your connection with all of the world rather than us and them, me and them, those people, that government, that situation, that other. We make the other a beloved other rather than a dreaded or a fearful other. The third tool is the art of failure. The art of failure. Now, in our culture, there's a lot of emphasis on setting goals, meeting our goals, living our dreams, on success. But there's not a lot that is taught about the art of failure. And failure is simply when something that you plan doesn't come together, such as what I described earlier. And when we fail, we feel vulnerable. There's a vulnerability that comes forth in us. And our ego does not like vulnerability. Our ego wants resolution. And so generally, we tend to follow our ego into blame. Okay, I'm going to blame the state of Arkansas that I'm not going to get my vaccine sooner. Or I'm going to blame the government or blame whoever. And then the next blaming game that we often take is to blame ourselves and to call ourselves a failure, depending on what the situation is, to label ourselves insignificant, incompetent, and a failure. But there's a third way, and that's to train ourselves to simply sit with that feeling. With that feeling of, if we want to call it failure, but we can call it the art of failure. To let ourselves be vulnerable. And this will not be easy. You may feel actual discomfort in your body when you try to do this. The ego is fighting so hard to get you out of that state of vulnerability. For the arch enemy and the nemesis of the ego is vulnerability. But you can train yourself to sit in that space. And you can become accustomed. You can get your nervous system to become accustomed and comfortable with the fact that you don't control everything in this world. That the world is actually quite impermanent and uncontrollable in many ways. And we can increase our ability to let go rather than to cling. That's what's painful to us, is when we're clinging to the outcome that we want, we're not going to get it. And we suffer because of that clinging. And so we let that go, the art of failure. And the last practice or approach that I present this morning is the path of non-rejecting. The path of non-rejecting. And I'm going to share with you a quote. Only by learning to fully embrace all aspects of ourselves, even the most seemingly negative elements of our minds and hearts, will we learn to fully embrace others. Only by discovering the basic goodness in both our lotus and our mud will we come to see the basic goodness of all living beings. In Buddhism, there's an analogy that's often taught about the lotus and the mud. The lotus is a beautiful flower that must make its way up through that sticky, yucky mud until it breaks through the surface of the water and blooms into this glorious, beautiful sight that delights all who see it. The mud is the muck that it must first move through before it can blossom. It's a beautiful analogy and one that has helped many, many people move through issues in their life, recognizing that we are all a lotus flower. We are all this beautiful flower just waiting to blossom. But in this teaching, there can be an element, a misinterpretation of rejection for what is that yucky, sticky mud. Well, that's the part of us, the part within us, that we don't always want to bring to the surface. It's our error thoughts. It's our polarization. It's our unaccepting. It's our judgment. It's our habits. It's those things that we'd rather not have other people see. And the point of this practice is not to reject those parts of us. Just as Lori said in the meditation, all parts of us are divine. There is nothing that is to be rejected, for that which we resist, we know in unity, persists. And so this art of path of non-rejecting is to recognize that the wisdom teachings tell us not to reject anything about ourselves. Embrace all aspects of ourselves. Gold is the same as dust. Lotus is part of the mud. So the practice is not really to get rid of the mud. Instead, rather than escalating or blowing out of proportion those aspects of us that we're still working on, we lean into it, even intensify it, and then let it go in a new context. Letting it go is just being part of life, part of what we're working on, but not damning it. For it is also divine. It's also leading us on our path. It's also giving us fertile ground with which to work. One way is to think of ourselves as the open sky and allowing those clouds to pass through. We don't resist any cloud, whether it is white and fluffy or dark and threatening. We just let those clouds pass through. And so those are the four approaches to consider today. Does it matter? Overcoming polarization, the fine art of failure, the path of non-rejecting. Choose one or two and use them as a practice this week. Use them as a challenge, so to speak, to find ways to live in these turbulent times and to bless our world, for we are here truly to love our neighbors as ourselves. And in unity, we so love and support these practical approaches to Christianity, to apply, to practice, to adapt, and to adopt as our own, eventually not only as practices, but as a lifestyle. And through this, we know we can change our world, for our world needs us. Our world needs us to live out loud, to love out loud, and to reveal the unstoppable brilliance that each one of us are. And together we say, and so it is, and so it is.